welcome back to my channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day so far, and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. Today I'm finally going to be doing a video that I've been meaning to do for a long time, and it's a revamped version of the very first video that I uploaded here on YouTube, which was titled 10 Things I Wish I Knew About Watercolors or something along those lines. And I uploaded that video in December of 2017, so that was over 18 months ago. Now, for some strange reason, that has been my most viewed video of all time. And because I know that there is so much interest in that specific topic, I wanted to make sure to revisit it and share the things that I have learned in the last year and a half that have passed since that video. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going over the list of 10 things that I had shared a while back, and perhaps completing the ideas a little bit better with the knowledge that I have today. And if the whole point I feel could be replaced by another important fundamental thing that beginners should know about, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay guys, so let's get into it. So the very first point that I share in that video in regards to the top things that I wish I knew as a beginner just starting out with watercolors was that it's very important to use watercolors on paper that is intended for this medium, or at the very least some kind of mixed media sketchbook that says right there on the cover that you can use water-soluble mediums in it. And this is a point that I still very much stand by, because really using regular pieces of paper with watercolor, it's gonna be super frustrating. The paper is gonna be buckling and breaking, and it's not really gonna give you a feel for what the medium is like. And I know how hard it can be, because I know that watercolor paper can be very expensive, but you have to know that there are brands out there like Strathmore and Canson that offer great quality for beginners at accessible prices. And I still use watercolor paper by these brands to the day whenever I'm creating paintings that I'm not intending to sell originals of, or for my classes or tutorial videos, all the time. Like for example, this ice cream cone illustration was created on Strathmore's 140-pound cold press 300 series watercolor paper, which I bought through Amazon and contains 12 sheets. And it cost me somewhere around $11. This brand has other types of paper that are even cheaper than this, and you know what? I am not afraid to say that in the beginning, I started out with the cheapest watercolor paper that I could get my hands on. What I used to do to make them last even longer was I used to cut these sheets of watercolor paper into halves or even fourths and create small studies with them and advance my skills in that way. So guys, don't get intimidated whenever you see videos or tutorials created by highly skilled, highly trained watercolor artists that tell you that the only way to use watercolors is on super expensive paper that is 100% cotton, etc., because you can certainly advance your skills on cheaper paper, and it's much better if you get a paper that isn't too precious to you and you're actually going to practice with. But I do highly recommend that you use actual watercolor paper, and if you can, buy 140-pound or thicker. I'm going to be leaving links to all of my favorite inexpensive watercolor painting supplies down below in the description box in case you want to go and check them out. And I'm also going to be leaving a link to a past video that I shared in which I go very much into depth about the different kinds of watercolor paper that exist, the different kinds of paint, and the different kinds of paintbrushes, and things that you should know about these supplies as a beginner just starting out that I do recommend you check out after this video. Moving on to the second point in the list, and this one was to plan the colors that you're going to be using before actually starting to paint. I still believe this is a huge one and a very important one for beginners to understand. Color is absolutely essential in making a painting look harmonious and cohesive. And because of this, it's very important that we give thought to the colors that we're going to be using, our color scheme, and not go through the painting process just picking random colors. Personally, I'm a very big believer in using a limited color palette. I like keeping things really simple and creating my different color mixtures using a limited number of colors. I also love giving thought to how I'm going to be darkening values and developing those shadows prior to starting with the painting process. Am I going to be bringing in analogous colors or complementary colors to deepen and darken my values, or am I only going to be using one same pigment to develop a wide variety of values in any specific area? And it's absolutely essential for anyone starting out with painting to learn about the color wheel and color relationships. Knowing about the color wheel is not only going to enable you to mix colors successfully and know exactly which color to reach for in order to create a specific color that you need to create, but it's also going to enable you to be able to create great combinations of colors that work together and help transmit the message or the mood or the idea that you want your painting to transmit. Alright, moving on to point number 3 in the list, and this one was to keep preliminary pencil sketches as light as possible. Now, of course, this doesn't apply if you actually want your pencil lines to show through. There is a style like that, and there are artists who love having their pencil lines or their pencil sketches show through the paint. Personally, in my case, I don't want my pencil lines to show through. And because I know that one of the main characteristics of watercolor is that it's transparent and not opaque, like for example, say gouache or acrylics, I have to make sure that I create my pencil sketch lightly. I like using an H or an HB pencil to create this preliminary sketch, and I wouldn't recommend any pencils that have a softer lead than that, because if you use a softer lead pencil, what can happen is that you leave a lot of graphite on your paper, and if this happens, then you run the risk of smudging it and making your colors appear muddy once you're moving ahead with the painting process. I like that in that first video of mine, I offer this great tip that I used a ton when I was first getting started. And it's to use a gray water-soluble pencil, like a watercolor pencil, to create that initial preliminary sketch, because then, as you're moving ahead in the painting process, the whole preliminary sketch kind of disappears. However, this technique might not be so useful for beginners that really like to map out every single highlight and dark area in that preliminary sketch, and that really depend on having these little shapes visible throughout the entire painting process, because many of these will disappear. In my case, it works because my preliminary sketches are just very, very basic. They are mostly outlines, and I really only mark the highlights and the darkest darks. And all of the other values I kind of just develop throughout the process by observing my reference picture. But anyway, to conclude this point, if you don't want your pencil lines to show through your painting, make sure that you're using a good pencil grade for the job, draw as lightly as possible, and also make sure that you're not scratching or damaging your watercolor paper, because any scratches that you leave behind are going to show through at the end. Moving on to point number 4 in that list, and this is still a huge one that I would always recommend beginners learn and practice, and this one is to plan and protect the highlights throughout the watercolor painting process. So some of the things that really attract so many people to watercolor is their ability to be very visually striking but light at the same time. They have this luminous glow to them. And a few of the reasons why artists are able to do this with watercolor is because watercolors are transparent and the paper underneath really shines through the paint. We're able to use our paint in combination with the beauty of the paper underneath to give life to our paintings. So prior to starting a watercolor painting, I highly recommend that you really pinpoint your highlights, where your highlights are located in whatever kind of reference you're using, whether you're using a photographic reference or something that you have right in front of you and you're painting from life. Really take time to pinpoint those highlights. And once you have pinpointed them, if you need to, map them out in your preliminary sketch and make sure that you're keeping them protected, working around them throughout the entire painting process, because Once you cover those areas with pigment, you may be able to lift some of the color up using an absorbent towel, but most likely you're not going to be able to go back to the initial white the paper once had. Now, another option to keep your whites protected is to use masking fluid, and this is something I have previously talked about. In this specific ice cream cone painting, I'm not using masking fluid, but I have shown my masking fluid process before. I'm going to make sure to leave a video in which I explain about using masking fluid with watercolors down below in the description box in case you want to go and check it out after this video. And a final suggestion that I want to give in regards to this specific point is to do a bit of visualizing before starting with your painting process, especially if you're intending to create a finalized painting like a landscape or a still life or something of the sort. Give thought not only to where the highlights or the lightest lights or the whites of the paper are going to be located in your painting, but also the areas that are going to be most transparent and where the paper is going to be visible most or shining through the paint. Always remember that it's very important to have variation in terms of lightness and darkness and transparencies when you're planning a visual composition. And planning for a certain level of contrast is always going to help your paintings be more visually striking. Moving on to point number 5 in my list, and this one was to start from very light and transparent and move on to darker and more saturated color as you go. This is something that you can see me do in this painting. I am getting darker and darker as I go, and it's something that I highly recommend beginners do because working in this way in combination with working in layers is going to allow you much more control when working with this medium. You're going to be able to get to know the medium a lot better and practice your water control and gain the confidence that you really need with watercolor, so that later on, if you want to move on to splashier techniques or looser styles, you're going to have a much better idea of what to do to create the effects that you want. So always start with a light translucent color mixture that has a lot more water than pigment in it and work towards darker values incrementally in layers and allowing each layer to dry in between. Unless you want the darker color to blur into the lighter color underneath. Always remember that watercolors expand on wet paper. So once you start working on your darker midtones and the darkest darks, unless you want that pigment to expand into your lighter midtones, allow that layer to dry completely and come back to it later once it's bone dry to apply those darker values only where needed. When it comes to watercolor, be careful and deliberate when you're placing those deeper, darker values, because if you go overboard with them or you start placing darker, super saturated color mixtures on your paper in big, blocky shapes, you really risk flattening out your painting and making it heavy. And back to one of the previous points, when it comes to watercolor, we want a certain lightness and a glow, a transparency. This doesn't mean that you should be afraid of placing the darkest values. Definitely don't be afraid of placing them. I'm just saying place them deliberately and carefully. I feel a lot of beginners are scared of going too dark with their paintings, but it's this contrast between super light values and dark values that are going to make your painting pop. Moving on to point number 6 in my list, and this one was to allow layers to dry in between. So when I was first getting started with watercolor painting, I cannot tell you how many paintings and how many pieces of watercolor paper I ruined because I overworked them. I had no idea that I was supposed to let a layer dry before moving in and attempting to do any more work on it. I continued going into the same area again and again, attempting to fix something, but I just ended up making it worse and even like creating holes through my paper. So what I learned in time is the importance of staying patient, and something that I started doing was jumping from one area of my painting to the other so that this way I could allow the area to dry completely while I was working on another section and then going back to the previous section to continue working on it later. Another thing I often do is work on two paintings simultaneously so that I don't waste any time. You can also use a hair dryer to speed up the process, but I would highly recommend keeping it at a medium heat level because otherwise you risk damaging or burning your paper. And of course, if you're using masking fluid, using a hair dryer is completely out of the question because when you're using masking fluid, the fluid gets attached to your watercolor paper and adhere to your watercolor paper a lot more strongly if you use heat on it, and then it's impossible to remove without damaging your paper. So whether you have used wet on wet techniques or wet on dry techniques or anything else, really practice noticing whether you have to allow that area to dry completely before moving back in, and if there's any doubt in your mind at all, it's better if you allow it to dry. Because once your paper is damaged, there's no going back to how it was before. In time and with practice, I promise you, you're gonna get better at realizing when you need to step away and allow that paper to dry and regain its strength. Alright guys, moving on to point number 7 in my list, and this one was don't use more than 3 colors in the same mixture unless you know what you're doing. And this one I think is the first one that I'm going to replace for another one, just because we already talked about how important it is to plan the colors that you're going to be using for your paintings and really learn the color wheel so that you can create effective color mixtures. So for this new number 7, I'm going to bring together 2 previous points from my previous list, and I'm going to create a brand new number 7 that I'm going to call Clean Brushes Between Colors and Replace Water Frequently. It's important to stay on top of these things because sometimes, because we're painting with watercolor, we kind of take for granted that we have removed all of the previous color from our bristles, but it's still there. And then we end up mixing colors together that we weren't intending to mix, and we create mud. And also, when we're working with very dirty, murky water, we risk dirtying up and muddying up our painting. Some artists work with 2 or even 3 containers of water. However many containers you decide to use is perfectly okay. Just make sure that you're keeping an eye on your water and changing it whenever you need to. Moving on to the new point number 8 for this list of 10 things I wish I knew about watercolors when I first started. And this one is something that I don't believe I mentioned at all in the previous video. And this one is to visualize and plan for the areas or layers of your painting in which you're going to be using wet on wet techniques versus wet on dry techniques. Especially when you're creating more complex paintings like finalized landscapes or still lifes that are composed of different layers and that have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. Making time to think about these things before you actually start with the painting process is essential because, as I mentioned before, you have to be aware that if you place pigment on wet paper or even damp paper, it's going to expand. Maybe to different degrees, but it's going to expand and blur out. So think about what areas of your painting you want more definition or detail in, and what areas you want blurred out. In my case, when I'm creating more complex and layered paintings, I leave wet on wet techniques for my background area or for my background elements that I want blurred out in the distance. And I use less and less water as I progress with the layers of the painting that are closest to me, the middle ground and the foreground. Usually I want more definition in these areas, or I want to detail them even more. And this is where dry on dry techniques come into play. It's entirely up to you, and it's really going to depend on the effects you're looking to create. I always suggest my students think of what area of their painting they want their focal point to be so that they can pull the viewer's attention to this specific area using dry on dry techniques and more definition and detail. By doing this, you're going to be creating a very nice visual contrast, which, as I said before, is very important. How you choose to play around with this contrast and develop your layers is entirely up to you, and it's going to depend on the type of subject that you like to paint. But I am going to recommend that you always give thought to what areas you're going to be using wet on wet techniques in and where you're going to be using wet on dry before starting with the painting process. All right, moving on to point number 9, and this is also a brand new one. And this one is to avoid flat blacks and create dark colors that have a temperature to them. Now, if you have been painting with watercolors and watching tutorials and knowledgeable people talk about their techniques, I'm pretty sure you've probably already heard that a lot of watercolor artists don't use black at all. And the reason this is because ready-made blacks, like say an ivory black, is a very flat color and it doesn't have a temperature and a liveliness to it. It tends to flatten areas out and create very stark looking marks. Not only this, but a lot of ready-made blacks tend to be very opaque, making certain areas of our painting appear dull. So what many of these artists do is they combine different colors together to create their darkest darks. There are many color combinations that we can use that I'm not going to get into today, but we can very easily create darkest darks that are very luminous and lively and rich. One of the mixtures that is very frequently used by watercolor artists is burnt sienna plus French ultramarine blue. Depending on the pigments that you choose for these darker mixes, as well as the ratios of each color that you use within your mix, you're going to make your darks more cool or warm biased. You're going to make them shift more towards the cool temperature or towards the warm temperature. And you want this. You want your colors that you use to have a temperature to them. All right, you guys, we're in the final stretch here. We have reached point number 10, and this one does relate to one of the points that I had previously shared in my other video, but I'm going to be adding in a bit of extra information. So point number 10 in my previous list was invest in quality over quantity when it comes to paint colors. And in this new list, it's going to be invest in quality over quantity when it comes to both paint and brushes. Now, once again, as I was mentioning in point number 1 of this list, when we are talking about the paper, I do not mean going out and buying the most expensive paint or the most expensive paintbrushes by any means. Really, I just have 2 expensive watercolor paint sets. One of them is this Schmincke set that I have right here in this video. And the other one is by Winsor & Newton, and the only reason why it's expensive is because I bought a huge set with a ton of different colors. But even that one is from their Cotman line or their student grade line. And all of the other watercolor paint sets that I love and still use a lot all cost anywhere from $20 to $30, and they last a very long time. So all I am saying really is when it comes to paint, don't go for the super cheap quality, chalky, Crayola watercolor paint, because if you do that, you're not really going to experience what the medium is like, and you're not really going to be able to progress your skills as fast as you would like. I really recommend taking time to do a little bit of research because there are brands out there, the same way that there are with paper, that offer great quality for accessible prices. And not only this, but they also offer different sizes of sets. Obviously, the smaller sizes, like say my Winsor & Newton Cotman Sketch Pocket Box, it costs a lot less than the other super expensive one that I was telling you about previously. And of course, as I was mentioning before, if we're looking to work with a limited color palette, then what does it matter if the set comes with 12 colors or 46 colors or whatever? It's much better to invest in a smaller set of colors that are better quality than investing in a huge set of all of these different colors that you're gonna notice that you're not using at all. We tend to get all googly-eyed when we see these huge boxes of all of these different colors, and we feel like we're gonna be all set if we get it. But in all honesty, a lot of those colors are really not gonna be used at all. Not to mention, by using a limited number of colors, you're gonna get a lot better, a lot faster at mixing the colors that you need. And finally, when it comes to paintbrushes, it's the exact same thing. We tend to get super excited when we see these huge sets with all of these different kinds of brushes. But you know what? I wasted so much money when I was first getting started with those sets. A lot of those paintbrushes didn't get used at all, and the ones that I did use fell apart pretty fast. I continued using the brushes from that paint set for a very long time, and even the first videos that I uploaded here on YouTube, you can see me working with them, even with them falling apart and stuff. But in time and with practice, I noticed which kinds of paintbrushes and sizes of paintbrushes I was reaching out most for, which were basically rounds and perhaps one larger flat, and that's it. And then, as I improved my skill and started gaining a little bit of money from the paintings that I was selling, I started investing in better quality supplies. That is when I decided to invest in better brushes. And this is where my Royal and Langnickel Zen line brushes come in. And now I only look specifically for the kinds of brushes and the sizes that I need for my specific style and subject that I paint. For most of my paintings, I am perfectly fine with just one 1-inch flat brush, as well as a few different sizes of rounds, perhaps a 4, 6, and 8, or a 2, 4, and a 6, or something like that, depending on the amount of detail that I'm planning to add in. And these are the kinds of brushes that I would recommend beginners get in the beginning because they are honestly the most versatile. And with practice, you're going to see that you're able to create a large variety of textures and effects using only these brushes. Rounds and perhaps a couple of flats at most. You don't need anything else. I absolutely love these Zen line brushes by Royal and Langnickel because they are super affordable. They cost anywhere from like $3 to $5. You can find them individually in the specific sizes that you need, and they have lasted me a very long time in great condition, even with my tough techniques and the tough love that I give them. Because I just love going back in and doing gentle scrubbing and scribbling with my paintbrush bristles and layering, etc. And they are still in great condition. Alright, you guys, this has been a very long video, but I really hope you got something from this and that I've inspired you to continue practicing with watercolor because it's truly an amazing medium. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I would love it if you left a thumbs up if you like this video because it really helps my channel get in front of more people. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next Friday and talk to you soon.